The best of the week on Relevant Radio.
When we look at the Civil War, it was a painful chapter in our nation's history. And it's easy to look, at something as being distant, black and white in photographs or, old battlefields. I've been to Gettysburg many times. You have these names etched into monuments, but the Civil War was more than just a military conflict. It was a national reckoning. It was a moment when political disagreement turned into open bloodshed, when you had brother fighting against brother. So when churches split, families were divided. When the very survival of the republic, it hung in the balance. And you sit back and you think, well, how does a nation founded on liberty and unity fracture so completely? And what led Americans who shared a constitution, a language, a common heritage? How do you take up arms against one another? I mean, this is really something to contemplate. I really want to dive into this today. And that's what I want to explore. Not just the battles, but really the buildup and the moral tensions and the constitutional arguments and the economic rivalries with the South and the failure of compromise and so much more. This was a war of enormous human costs. I'm joined today, as I said, by Dr. Susan Hanssen. She's an associate professor of history at the University of Dallas. She's been walking us through this series, and she's here today to give us a look at the Civil War. Professor, thank you for your time. Thanks for what you've done so far.
Thank you so much for having me on. And I hope that people will enjoy this afternoon remembering the greatest conflict to take place on the North American continent, the great conflict of the American Civil War. It's really a centerpiece of our history. And I think you're right that in the midst of everything that we're going through right now as a country, worldwide, that it's a good time to reflect, to remember, this amazing episode in the history of America. 600,000 dead.
Wow.
That's more casualties than Americans had in any previous war, or all of the previous wars put together, and any war since. So I think it is worthwhile to look at those 5 years of war from 1860, the election of Abraham Lincoln, and the secession of the Southern states, all the way to 1865 with the surrender of the Southern states and the assassination of Lincoln, the first political assassination in our history. Please God, we don't have another political assassination in our future. So this was really, it's a centerpiece of American history. Yeah. And as I tell the story, I want to emphasize particularly, maybe because of the context in which we're living as a nation right now, to emphasize the fact that the American Civil War is a war that's on the world stage, that we were being watched by the British, by the French, by the Russians, that there was a lot of involvement of international powers who are kind of watching this experiment in a liberal democratic republic on the American continent. And so I'd like to add the foreign policy element of this, the story of diplomacy, the story of espionage, and the American Navy, because I think sometimes we focus so much on the battles on the ground, thinking about the battles in Virginia or the battles along the western frontier along the Mississippi, that we forget about what was going on abroad, and we forget about the important aspect of naval power for America, even during the American Civil War. So we begin with a series of very dark winters for America. And so sometimes it's hard to remember that the rest of the country is still kind of deep in winter.
Wow.
And during the beginning of the American Civil War, the winter of 1860, secession winter, followed by the winter of 1861, which was a kind of strategy winter, trying to lick our wounds from the first battles and come up with a plan for a much longer war than we had expected. And then by the winter of 1862, there was a stalemate, a military stalemate, and escalating casualties with no hope of victory on either side. So it was 3 very dark winters at the beginning of the American Civil War. So we begin in 1860 with the election of Lincoln, and there is a certain sense in which Lincoln could not have been elected if the great Democratic Party, which had controlled the presidency, the Senate, and also the Supreme Court for 3 decades, had not fought against itself. They appointed both a Southern Democrat and a Northern Democrat, 2 different candidates from the Democratic Party fighting against each other in the presidential election of 1860. This is a good warning. Very often we get disgruntled with people in our own party, but it's a good warning of what can happen. That because the Democratic Party split, really it was the Democratic Party that split first, and that split the nation. Some of the churches had split before that: the Methodist Church, the Baptist Church, into Southern Baptists and Northern Baptists, into Southern Lutherans and Methodists and northern parts. So some of the churches had broken up over the issue of slavery and the extension of slavery to the westward. But it was really the split of the Democratic Party that enabled this new party. The Republicans had never won an election. They had only fielded a presidential candidate once before. Allowed a new party and a very new politician. Abraham Lincoln had only had one short term in the House of Representatives. He had never been a senator. He had never been a governor. He was not a major player in the political life of the nation before his election in 1860. And so we see a new party and a new man coming into office because the Democratic Party imploded and split the vote. And immediately in November, immediately after Lincoln's election, in November and December, the Southern states, one after another, starting with South Carolina, seceded from the Union and called their own constitutional convention, wrote a new constitution for the Southern Confederacy, which was identical almost in every particular to the United States Constitution, except for the fact that it made mention explicitly of a right to own slaves. There wasn't, in fact, any provision to give the states more rights in the Southern Confederacy's Constitution than there was in the United States Constitution. There wasn't a right of secession sort of explicitly written into the new Confederacy's Constitution. Really, the striking element was that they used the word slaves, which the United States Constitution never did. The United States Constitution referred to persons held to servitude and always upheld the language of personhood, even for the slaves. And so immediately they held a new election in the South and elected a president for the Southern Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. And all of that, the secessions of the 7 deep South states, the Constitutional Convention of the South, and the election and inauguration of their new president, all happened before Lincoln officially took office, before his inauguration the following year. And so when Lincoln arrived in Washington, D.C. in March of 1861, the secession was a fait accompli. There was nothing he could do about it. It had happened during the lame duck months of the presidency of Democratic President James Buchanan. And so Lincoln simply had secession presented to him on a silver platter on the day of his inauguration. And the question that was immediately presented to him was whether or not to resupply the American fort in the port of Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, the first of the Southern states to secede. He had said in his inaugural address that he would not attack the South, that the question of war was in their hands. They would not fire on the South. He said that they would make sure that the mails went through because the federal post offices belonged to the federal government, and they would make sure that the federal mails were delivered. And they would defend federal military property, but they let most of the forts in the South go. But the ports, they said they would hold. And so Fort Sumter, he said that he would resupply it simply with food, not with ammunition, and that the fort, the Union held fort, would not fire on the city. But when they made the attempt to bring provisions into the fort by sea, South Carolina fired on the Union federal fort guarding the port of Charleston, South Carolina, and those were the first shots fired in the American Civil War.
That was the Best of the Week on Relevant Radio. The best way to listen to the Best of the Week is on the Relevant Radio app, free and always free. Download and share the #1 free Catholic app today in the App Store.